Jianwu and his sister Hawa are walking through a field, when a fairy suddenly appears above them. Jianwu is shocked and asks Hawa what it is. The fairy apologizes for surprising them and introduces herself as the dungeon farmland's protective fairy. Jianwu is still confused and wonders if it's a bug. Hawa, understanding his confusion, tries to explain that it's a fairy. The fairy introduces herself, but Jianwu is still shocked and thinks she looks like a bug. The fairy is embarrassed and explains that she was mistaken because of his size. Hawa tries to calm Jianwu down by saying that she's a fairy. The fairy asks for Jianwu's name, but he forgets. She asks him if she can start introducing herself again, and then welcomes him to the dungeon farmland. Jianwu is still surprised but thanks her for the welcome. The fairy then says that she will explain the dungeon farmland to him. The fairy explains that the dungeon farmland is different from normal dungeons. It's a unique dungeon that can grow. She explains that it's similar to how a farmer grows crops. The dungeon grows based on the farmer's skill. Jianwu was surprised to hear this and asks if he's been in a dungeon before. The fairy answers that he has not and then tells him that this dungeon is special. It's a dungeon that can grow and even the way it grows is based on the farmer's skill. She then explains that this dungeon is all his, and he can grow it however he wants. Jianwu was still confused because he thinks all dungeons in Korea are owned by the government. The fairy assures him that this dungeon is his. She then shows him her weapon, which is a spear and a shield, to prove that she is protecting the dungeon from anyone else. Jianwu then asks how the dungeon is his. The fairy explains that as long as she is there, nobody else can enter the dungeon without her permission. This means that this dungeon is his, and he can farm in it. She then asks him if he likes it. Jianwu, still excited about the dungeon being his, tells the fairy that he likes it. He then asks her to show him around. The fairy happily agrees, and takes him to the side of the field, telling him to follow her. She then flies up and Hawa follows her. Jianwu realizes this is Hawa's first time flying with someone the same age as her. He thinks it's nice that she's made a friend. Jianwu feels nervous about Hawa flying near the edge of the cliff. The fairy reassures him that there is no danger because the wall is solid and won't break. Hawa keeps flying up, and Jianwu panics, yelling her name. Hawa comes back down and giggles. Jianwu is relieved and asks her if she wants to play too. Hawa replies yes and then flies up again, laughing. Jianwu tries to catch her but she keeps flying higher. The fairy tells Hawa to slow down, and then apologizes to Jianwu, saying that she was too excited. She explains that she is currently receiving punishment, and is therefore unable to speak informally with the spirit farmer, Jianwu. Jianwu, having not introduced himself yet, says his name is Li Jianwu. The fairy thinks his name is cool and then realizes he doesn't have a name yet because he's still being punished. She offers to give him a temporary name. Jianwu agrees and asks for a name. The fairy suggests L. Jianwu thinks L is a perfect name for the fairy. The fairy blushes and says it's a pretty name. Hawa agrees, and Jianwu asks her if she thinks so too. The fairy then explains that she has been promoted to a dungeon spirit. A text box appears showing that the fairy has received a name from the spirit farmer Li Jianwu, and has been promoted to a dungeon spirit, while the dungeon spirit L has been accepted as a recruit. It also mentions that the fairy's magic has been depleted by 5 points. The fairy says that she will now be called L, and from now on she will be in Jianwu's care.